I'm delighted. My name is Mark Smith, by the way, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Southampton University. And it's a great pleasure to play this role. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Professor Sir Ian Diamond, who is the National Statistician, in which role he leads the Office for National Statistics and the Government Statistical Service. And in fact, it's welcome back for Ian, because Ian is a Southampton person of old, progressing to the role of Deputy Vice Chancellor, from which launch pad he went on to lead the Economic and Social Sciences Research Council, and then went on to be the Principal, the Vice Chancellor of Aberdeen University, which is where I got to know Ian really well. So it's nice to welcome Ian back, both from an institutional and a personal perspective. Ian's going to talk about his core expertise of statistics, but you should realise he's also been the author of many influential reports that have affected the higher education sector, and particularly he looked with his report on funding in Wales. But tonight he's here to talk to us about the role of a National Statistics Institute in a pandemic, and I can say that this is something that Southampton's really interested in. We've had long-standing interactions with the Office for National Statistics. It's an area where we have much expertise, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Ian about how he coped and what demands were put on him and his office during the last couple of years. So Ian, over to you.
Mark, thank you very much. And colleagues, it's an enormous privilege to be here this evening. Next slide, please. And I did want to talk very much about how the Office for National Statistics, that's the UK's National Statistics Institute, responded to the challenges of this dreadful pandemic that has consumed so many of our lives for the last 2 years. Within that, the mission of the UK statistical system, and I've just put it there to be really clear. Our job is to provide high quality data and analysis to inform the UK, improve lives and build the future. That might mean that our job is to provide loads and loads and loads and loads of data. What I want to really impress this evening is that what we need to do is provide insight and not deluge. And we do this within our strategy, statistics for the public good. Our job is not only to inform government, but to be the nation's National Statistics Institute, absolutely providing a voice in our data for every citizen, using radical data sources, being ambitious, inclusive and sustainable. Next slide, please. And I have to say, and next slide, please, we didn't just start at the pandemic. We noticed before the pandemic that actually a National Statistics Institute couldn't look backwards as often they had done in the past. We had to be timely and absolutely on board. And so we'd worked prior to the pandemic to produce gross domestic product, that's a measure of the economy, on a monthly basis rather than looking back quarterly. We recognized the need for regional data, so producing regional growth rates for the first time, so we were ready. And we recognized also that we could do so much, but we needed to work in partnership. And Mark, it's now 30 years, I think, since Chris Skinner, the late Chris Skinner, set up a link with the Central Statistics Office to do business surveys. And it's absolutely brilliant that our partnerships with Southampton still go on. And I know colleagues are helping at the moment, looking at some work on actually calculating the excess deaths that have occurred as a result of this dreadful pandemic. Next slide, please. But in the beginning of 2020, the pandemic came, and our first challenge that I was asked is, well, actually, what's the course of the pandemic? How many people in our country had COVID-19? Next slide, please. And the simple answer was, at that time, we didn't know. The daily testing data give an indication of pace of change, but actually how many people were in the country with the virus. And the only thing we could think of doing was to do a large survey, which we do rather well. And we set up in April 2020, something called the Coronavirus Infection Survey, and the design that I was really keen on, the design I wanted to do was a household survey, so to take swabs from every member of a household over the age of 2, and then rush them to a laboratory and test them for COVID, and at the same time take blood from everyone in the household over the age of 12 to be able to look at antibodies, and at the same time households being kept in a longitudinal way in the sample so that we could look at things like reinfections. And if you look at the slide on the top left, you'll see the picture for England since 2020, and you can see it goes on, different waves, and then the most recent Omicron wave, which I think is worth saying has been by some distance the highest percentages that we have seen. 1 in 15 people in the community at the beginning of January having that virus. But of course, at the same time, through things like the brilliant vaccination program, through things like better treatments, we have been able to manage those higher levels with many lower hospitalizations and deaths. Next slide, please. At the same time, I mentioned immunity, and I'd just like to take your eyes to the bottom left here to where it says 70 to 74. There are 3 lines on each of these graphs, which are for different ages. But what we have here, the light blue, is a measure of antibodies, a measure of immunity, but I have to say it's a relatively low level, and we know that doesn't imbue an enormous protection from transmission. The darker blue is a much higher threshold. And what we see there for the 70 to 74-year-olds, you can see it go up until about April 21, and that was associated with the initial vaccination program, then a decline because vaccines wane, and then an increase, and the green line at the bottom is the booster. And so the booster pushing the levels of immunity in that age group up very, very high. And I think the real benefits of the booster are really super important. But of course, the survey still has enormous need to be able to monitor over time the continued immunity as well as other things. Next slide, please, including, of course, different variants. And I remember getting a phone call from Sir Patrick Vallance in December 2020 saying, Ian, have you seen anything about a new variant, which we now know as the Alpha variant? And we had spotted it within a couple of days. And on the left-hand side there, you can see a graph which shows how the Delta variant, that the Delta is in pink, the Alpha is in blue, very quickly took over, particularly in England from the Alpha. And on the right-hand side, how during November, December of 2021, the pink again is Delta, so still relatively high, but then in the middle of December, Omicron just came and rose really, really fast. And being able to do this at pace for this survey has been incredibly important. No other country has a survey like this, and it's been, next slide please, it's been recognised by a number of people. Chris Whitty really kindly said it's the gold standard. James Doidge in America, one of the most valuable resources on the planet, and indeed the head of the WHO. The CIS is great, and the UK is the only country in the world to have such a survey. We're very proud at ONS to have done it, and I would just say my colleagues have been totally brilliant. Just for example, around Christmas, when it was clear that Omicron was doubling at a rate of every couple of days, we said, well, we can't wait a week because people are taking a Christmas break to put out the next numbers. And so people were absolutely in the office doing analysis on the 26th of December. And the other point I would just make is that too often people think that official statisticians, get some data and get out a blank sheet of paper, a few 5-bar gates, put a number out. The numbers that you have seen are the results of the most amazing statistical analysis. And it's been great in partnership to work with Professor Sarah Walker from the University of Oxford, who I was privileged to teach on the Southampton programme, and is one of many people, Mark, to go from the Southampton programme onto great things. Next slide, please. But as well as looking at the positivity, sadly, what are the outcomes of infection? Next slide, please. And the first thing, sadly, is that many people have died. We look on a weekly basis at those deaths that are registered on death certificates, and on the left-hand side, the blue records deaths where either the primary or secondary cause of death was COVID-19, and you can see that the very high blues map very closely with the first two big waves. The dotted line is a 5-year average, and so you can see right at the left-hand corner, the dotted lines above the green. That was because deaths were relatively low in the beginning of 2020, and so the registration over time shows those two enormous peaks, but as I indicated earlier, much lower peaks very recently. And on the right-hand side, some work we've done which looks at age mortality rates by different income deciles, and what we see are much higher levels of mortality for those in the lowest income decile than for those, the light blue, in the highest income decile. And so, as we see in so many illnesses, there is a strong income gradient here in COVID-19. Next slide, please. And also, we've been able to look at contrasts by ethnicity. We do this because there is no ethnicity on a death certificate, so we link ethnicity to the census data. Sorry, we link the death certificate to the census data, and that gives us ethnicity, but then we link further a whole set of socioeconomic factors and geographic factors, and then finally we link the vaccine status to. And what this shows, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but if you look on the left-hand side for men, and this is for the 6 months up to the end of December, or to the 1st of December 2021, and if you look at that black African, the light blue is for men of black African heritage, and there is a higher risk than those who are white British of, sadly, mortality. When you control for the inherent disadvantage in that population, you reduce some of that effect. When you control for vaccination status, then you lose the effects. And that, I think, is so important, and it says so much about the positive impact of really targeting the vaccination program appropriately at different groups. Next slide, please. The other point I wanted to make is about symptoms. Long COVID is something that has been talked about a lot. We've been looking very closely at long COVID. The left-hand slide here looks at the tall blue histogram is the proportion of people who are reporting symptoms between 4 and 8 weeks after infection. That's very, very high. It goes down. We compare that with the green line, which are those people who haven't had COVID, but they've also got, a sore throat or something like that. The point being that we estimate over 1 million people in the population have long COVID at any time. And on the right-hand side, just a note about how different variants have different symptoms. If you go to the top left, you will see that loss of taste and loss of smell, those two histograms in the top left, both of them quite strong symptoms for the Alpha, for the Delta. But when we come to Omicron, goes right down. Really important that we've been able, through our surveys, to be able to inform UK Health Security Agency, with whom we work very, very closely, about how to target people's understanding of symptoms. Next slide, please. And finally, look, I've just got to show you this. This is so exciting for me personally. 2021, by the way, thank you to everybody who filled in their census form. I know you all did. It's so incredibly helpful. These are the first results ever from the 2021 census, and I'm so pleased to be able to show them, Mark, here at Southampton. And what this does is link vaccine data to census occupation data in 2021 to be able to look at the different vaccination status of different occupations. So in the top left, health professionals, and you can see that almost 76% of health professionals had 3 vaccine doses, and that goes down to those, for example, in construction towards the bottom right, at about 43.4%. This is incredibly important in targeting advertising, but also really understanding the potential impact of the virus. Next slide, please. But it is not only the virus itself that's incredibly important, because the government, absolutely rightly in my view, it took a whole set of non-pharmaceutical interventions in order to be able to manage the virus. And so the third challenge is, how do we understand what happened? Well, you wouldn't be at all surprised, next slide please, to know that a National Statistics Institute does a survey. So we put together an opinions and lifestyle survey. Now, people think the National Statistics Institutes, take a long time to do things. The first of these surveys was designed in about 3 days, and it goes out to a random sample of the population on a Wednesday. We get the responses by the following Monday, and we publish on Monday lunchtime, so that we are able to give really timely and speedy results around a whole set of questions. And the questions vary with the things that are important, things like face coverings, the percentage avoiding contact, a whole range of issues that we look at. Next slide, please. And just to give you an example, the blue line there is the line over time. Now, the left-hand side is the 20th to the 30th of March 2020. We've got these on a weekly basis, and the right hand is 6th to the 16th of January. And you can see that there's been a steady decline, really, in the percentage of people who are worried about the effect of COVID on their life. And you can see the Omicron wave at the right-hand side going up. But interestingly, the green line is the percentage of working adults who have worked from home at some point in the last 7 days. And I think it's really important. There is much discussion in the media to talk about working from home, getting back to the office. I mean, I think it's worth saying that for around 60%, 50 to 60% of the population, that really isn't an issue. They have to go to their workplace to work. And this more or less constant line throughout the pandemic of the proportion of people who have worked from home at some stage is, I think, an important point. Next slide, please. And if I look at the next one, the light blue at the top are people who always work, if you like, away from home. Blue is work from home only, and green is moving the two. And you can see that the steady decline in the work from home only in the autumn of 2021. The blue shading is when there was a formal lockdown. But I do think it's important to recognise that for a great proportion of our population, the option of working from home is not one that they would recognise. Next slide, please. And also, a part of the strategy was to, if you like, reduce mobility. So we use Google Places, we web scrape Google Places in order to look at how people are moving around. And so we do this with various areas: retail and recreation, supermarkets, parks, residential areas, workplaces and public transport. Anything below that baseline means that use is below the pre-pandemic baseline. And so you can see that Google Play searches in residential areas remain above the pre-pandemic, parks goes up and down, and retail and recreation remains even now below what we would expect historical averages to be. Next slide, please. So far, so good. We've looked at, if you like, the social sides, we've looked at the actual pandemic. Let's ask ourselves some questions, if I may, about what the impact of the pandemic has been on the economy. What's the impact on the economy? Next slide, please. Well, the first thing to say is inflation is a key part of the job of any National Statistics Institute, and we publish monthly figures on inflation. And what the graph there gives you is two of our figures. One, the light blue one is consumer price index, the dark blue one is consumer price index adjusted and adding in housing. The pink one is a housing index, and that is always a bit different overall, but it is important to look at because it represents such a high proportion of people's spending. I just wanted to make a point that the way we calculate these is to identify a basket of about 700 goods, which we then get prices for. Well, that's great, but when the shops are closed, how do you get a price? Not too easy. Also, when things are taken out of the market, how do you get a price? And we had to do an enormous amount of work, a lot of it through web scraping, to get prices when we couldn't go in to, for example, supermarkets because of safety features during some of the lockdowns. But also we have done some, I think, quite impressive modelling to get some imputation. And what you see is a graph where you can see the recent increase in inflation and the discussions that go around that. I think it's important also to recognise we are having conversations with someone called Jack Monroe at the moment, which is just to identify how these inflation indices work for different parts of the population. We're very committed to being an organisation which brings inclusivity into the heart of what we do. Next slide, please. But at the same time, also, we thought we'd better find out what businesses are doing. And so alongside that opinion survey that I told you about a little earlier, we also put together something we call the Business Insights and Conditions Survey, going out initially weekly, now fortnightly. This is a really agile survey that goes out to a large sample of businesses and has been able to look at both all aspects to do with trading. It's been able to look at all the aspects to do with furloughing and financial performance. And these three slides that I've just given you are those who have trading ceased, or sometimes sadly permanently ceased trading. The impact of turnover. At the end of the day, a third of businesses reporting a decrease in turnover compared with previous years. And also we look at cash reserves. These surveys, the questions that we ask, are put into place on a fortnightly basis in talking with the Treasury, the Bank of England, the Cabinet Office, the Department for International Trade, Department for Business. It's a real attempt to provide all parts of government with the information that they need. But one of the questions that we do have, next slide please, is to what extent is the consumer spending? So this slide uses interbank transfer, daily interbank transfer data, which enables us to look at spending on credit and debit cards. And we can look at these in all kinds of ways. But this slide that I've given you here takes us from January 2020 through till just a couple of last week. And the light blue, which is more or less flat at the top, is spending on staples, food, for example. And you can see a big jump. Well, you can see two big jumps really there. The first big jump was when a lot of people went out and bought an enormous amount of food ahead of the first lockdown, and then Christmas, of course, gets a big jump. On the other hand, the red at the bottom is spending, we call it social, so that's on hospitality, on accommodation, on travel, and all kinds of things like that. And you will see that despite a pickup, it absolutely remains below pre-pandemic levels. We can also, and one of the things we've spent a lot of time at, we can also distinguish between in-person spending and online spending, and that's actually something that's quite important. Now, for most of the time, you can work that out. Your spending on Amazon is online. But there was one that we were a bit concerned about initially, which was online spending on beer in pubs. And a bit confused about that. But then it turns out, for those people who are experts on this, I must admit I'm not, that you can go to some pubs and get an app, and you order your beer through your app. The beer is, or other drinks are available, and that is brought to you. And the bottom line here is that if you order through an app, then you are online spending for your drink. So we had to make some adjustments to adjust for that in a way that enables to get reliable estimates of spend. I mentioned that we also had online and in-person spending, and it is the case that we can also look at footfall. Next slide, please. We look at footfall by using data from Springboard, and the message is that daily retail footfall now, the top graph at the top there, is about 80% of pre-pandemic levels. And when I split that up into types of data, we find that it is the high street and shopping centres that have really done poorly. Retail centres have come back up the kind of turquoisey line to around about 100%. And next slide, please. And travel is also an incredibly important part of the economy and understanding travel. And so we can spin up traffic cameras from all over the country and check on travel. I've just put some numbers here from London, which actually came from TfL, which do amazing things, and also from the northeast. And what you see is the number of transport movements between March 2020 and more recently. And the bottom line is that in the main, we are not far off, particularly in the northeast there, where we were behind, but still a little bit lower. Next slide, please. And then finally, I thought I'd just put in, given the conversations that we have at the moment about this, some points on price of gas. We get these on a daily basis and then calculate them into 7-day rolling averages, and you can see the really big increases going through to December, a bit of a drop and then a bit of an increase again. So understanding the economy and being able to still estimate the economy and give information to government on the economy while at the same time things were different and closed has been an important part. And also using these faster indicators, the daily price of gas, credit cards, incredibly important for us. Next slide, please. But then people ask, what's the impact of the pandemic on the labour market? If you go back to 2020, then there were big, if you like, questions. This could be the end of the labour market as we know it. Well, what has been the impact, and how has the labour market responded to the pandemic? Next slide, please. Well, the answer is it's responded pretty well. Top left, unemployment rate as measured by our labour force survey. You can see that it went up at the beginning of the pandemic, but has largely come down to levels roughly where we were beforehand. We also look on a daily basis at the number of people who are employees on PAYE with HMRC. So that's employees, not self-employed. And you can see that the number of employees is now bottom left above pre-pandemic levels. On the other hand, at the top right, the employment rate is a bit lower than it was, and I'll turn to that in just a moment. But regardless of much foreboding, I think the government strategies around furloughing have really worked, because if we look at redundancies, and HR1 is a form that you have to send into government to say you're going to make more than 20 redundancies, then there was a great expectation that there would be a further peak in redundancies at the end of furlough. And I think it's a tribute to the government's economic strategy that we really haven't seen that. But that top right, employment rate not back up to the levels that it was, although unemployment is low. So what's happened? Somebody must have left the labour market. Next slide, please. And what we've seen is that, yes, inactivity has gone up, the top left there, steady increase in inactivity. And who is more inactive? Bottom left, it's people over 50. We have seen a flight from the labour market of people over 50, and that reverses trends from the previous 2 decades of people with better well-being, issues of pensions, being prepared to work for longer. From our labour force survey, we're able to say that what they are saying in the main is that they've decided to retire, or increasingly saying that they're long-term sick. But we are now, just in the last few days, we've put together a new survey which is going out to the over 50s who have left the labour market to understand very quickly. We'll have the results in 2 or 3 weeks, Mark, to understand very quickly about what what are the reasons behind those older people disengaging with the labour market? The other issue, next slide please, that the labour market talked about is with migration. The left-hand slide shows net migration. That's the difference between in migrants and out migrants in the period over the last decade. And Mark, what that shows, as you can see, that until 2019, largely we were a nation which was a net in migrant place. 2020, as I don't think anyone would be surprised, very little migration overall. But what we've seen at the same time is a reduction post-referendum in the number of EU workers, a reduction of a couple of 100,000, but at the same time a steady increase in the number of non-EU workers, and that means that the difference is not that great, but sectorally it may be rather different. Next slide please. And though the question is, can employers get staff? So we look at vacancies, and on the left hand side top there, the green line is vacancies in 2021 against the two blue lines, 2020 and 2019. The number of vacancies in December 2021 at levels that we hadn't seen. The right hand side shows this for a whole range of sectors, and again 2021 is the bluey line at the top, and basically says that it's every sector, whether it is education, transport, wholesale and retail, catering, hospitality, accounting and finance, everywhere has vacancies. We did see a bit of a decline in the end of December, but we think that maybe seasonal. Will have a laser focus on that in the future. And when we talk through our business insights and conditions survey, the one that I talked about with employers, they're saying, look, there's a lack of qualified applicants, so skills is an issue. It's a low number of applicants, and in accommodation and food report very often a reduced number of EU applicants, and then sometimes pay is mentioned, which I'll come to right now. Next slide please. Because where are there going to be challenges? Mark, I could now give an hour's lecture on different sectors. I'm just going to look at two, if I may. The first of these, next slide please, is HGV drivers. A lot of talk about HGV drivers, and what we've seen is a real decline in the number of HGV drivers, and this has come about in a number of ways. Firstly, a big decline, the right hand side, in men and women aged 46 to 55 working as HGV drivers, so people getting out of that particular sector. At the same time, a reduction, 21% fewer EU nationals in the sector than before, and equally there are very high costs to young people who wish to go in. The cost to get a license can be prohibitive to many people when there are alternatives out there, and so that's caused the challenges that there are. I would have to say that our work on salaries in vacancies has shown a really quite a big increase over the last year in the salaries being offered, but we certainly do have to address these questions, and these data go straight into the centre of government, where the team working on supply chains is able to use them. And the other one I just would point out to you, next slide please, is manufacturing. The reason I point this out is because the demography here is important. If you look, the left hand side goes from 2015 to 2021, and what you're finding is that progressively the proportion of people working in manufacturing is getting older. These people are going to retire, and so we would say this is a challenge for the future, is ensuring that we've got a good stream, a new pipeline of younger people coming into manufacturing, or we could see real challenges. Next slide please. Key points on professions. I could said some things about Omicron. Omicron really did have a big impact in January on the number of people having to take time off through illness. The older workforce disengaging with the labour force, issues around the attractiveness of professions, and in some sectors fewer numbers of foreign workers presenting a challenge. Really important issues, I think, for our country to face. Next slide please. Final challenge is, as I said, we're a national statistics institute which has to be able to communicate not only to government, and I have to say government has been absolutely brilliant in really wanting good communication and really wanting the very best from any slides or from any dashboards, and during the second half of the first wave and onwards, we embedded a team in the number 10 communications group to do the slides for the podium press conferences. Next slide, please. But increasingly over time, here it is, a picture of Southampton. I love a picture of Southampton. And the point I just wanted to make is that we are increasingly moving to becoming a subnational data organisation. And the reason for that, just look at Southampton. The darker blue are the very dark blue are postcodes where the income is in the top decile of the country. The very, very dark purple is incomes where postcodes where the income is in the lowest decile of the country. You take a mean there, Southampton sort of looks in the middle. But actually, if you want to target your interventions at those people most in need, you need subnational data. And we're doing an enormous amount of work at the moment with maps like that on subnational data. Next slide, please. And also making things available and delivering insightful visualization. We're passionate that every citizen should have a voice in our data. We are also passionate that every citizen should be able to engage with our data. And that means we have a role, we would argue, in not only providing data for government, but in improving digital literacy. And we have also produced a MOOC, which provides a data masterclass, as it's called, which many senior civil servants has taken. And Professor David Spiegelhalter and I will be giving a day's masterclass on data to members of the cabinet later in February. So looking forward to that very much. Next slide, please. I'm just going to say a few final words, Mark, if I may, about the future and also what should a National Statistics Institute in the future do. So what's next? How do we deliver for the public good? Next slide, please. We want to be absolutely ambitious in our attempts to answer critical questions. Now, look, I think it's really super important. People say to me very often, Ian, the Office for National Statistics is independent. If you're answering critical questions, do you lose your independence? I say absolutely not. Our job is to be relevant. So it is right that we have people embedded in the centre of government to understand what are the critical questions that we need answer to. We want our data to provide insight. Then we use the very best techniques we can to calculate our statistics, and our statistics are our statistics. And the government has been fantastic in asking those, getting ever better at asking those questions. We do our very best to be able to provide an independent, trustworthy answer to those questions. But as I hope I've demonstrated, Mark, we need to be radical in thinking what is a type of data these days. What are data? Data are not simply a survey. Data are not simply administrative data. Sometimes they're born digital data. Sometimes they come from a wide variety of public and private sources. And we need to be radical in taking opportunities and collaborating, particularly with private sector organisations, in order to enable us to be able to provide insight into so many areas. We need to be inclusive, and we need to continue the sustainable partnerships such as those that we have with Southampton, which has added so much in terms of advice, in terms of methodology, as well as many people who have seen their careers, as I did with the Office for National Statistics. Next slide, please. And then finally, 2 slides, if I may. Go back to where I started. Why are we here? We're here to provide high quality data and analysis to inform the UK, improve lives and build the future. So bottom line is that that means that the Office for National Statistics has to be the source of trusted data on the economy, on society, and on health. And what that means is that we've got to be agile. And the one thing I do know is that the economy, society in particular, change very, very quickly. What does that mean? We must change. We absolutely have to change. So we're an organisation that is always recognising that the things we are measuring are changing, and therefore asking ourselves questions about how we should measure those differences. Secondly, as I hope I've demonstrated, timeliness is absolutely critical here. Timeliness. We need data in the world in which we live which answer questions as quickly as possible. However, we should never, ever, ever, if you like, swap timeliness for quality. Quality and trustworthiness has to be at the heart of everything that we do. And I can assure you, we worry enormously about quality. We worry about the representativeness of our samples. We worry about the statistical techniques we are using. Fundamentally, transparency has to be at the heart. You need to feel that when we've calculated something, you can absolutely get and look at how we've done that. We're always putting out blogs, putting out reports which say this is how we calculate things. I've talked about relevance, and we've also always got to innovate. So what does that mean for a future National Statistics Institute? Last slide, please. It means new innovative sources of data, policy relevant insight, data sharing. Think of any big problem. Think about climate change. Think about leveling up. Think about health. No one department, no one data set covers everything. So we need systems approaches. We need to share data from many sources, both inside and outside of government, and we are doing that. We need to revolutionise survey design. People say to me, Ian, will there be any surveys in the future? And my answer is 100% yes, there will. I can see no reason that we won't need surveys, but we need to think about multi-method. We need to think about mixing online and interviewer surveys. We need to design surveys in an ever more exciting way, and we need to be able to get the results quicker. I haven't talked about the census. Apart from mentioning it, I could have done, but we need to think about population estimates. A little later this year, we're going to be producing monthly local area population estimates. So instead of, big areas or the nation on an annual basis, we will produce on a monthly basis using administrative data from all kinds of sources, local area population, and indeed migration and movement estimates. So building that whole new world of speed. And finally, as well as working closely to inform government, we need to inform the public, and we need to think about the best ways to involve the public in our decision making, to engage with the public in how we should use data, and we need to make our descriptions and our narrative accessible to all. Those are big challenges, but if a National Statistics Institute can take them on, and I believe we can at the ONS deliver that for the UK, then I think we will be continually trusted and seen as good guardians of the resource we get to deliver data for our country. Mark, thank you very much. It's been an enormous privilege to say this, and I'm very happy to take questions, which I think Jane's going to chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Wow, that was a real tour de force. And you've also just reminded me why I became a demographer. And I think, we've got many of our students online tonight who'll be listening to you. And I should have said, Mark missed this out in his introduction, but of course, Ian actually founded the Department of Social Statistics and Demography at the University of Southampton, and is actually instrumental for why we have an undergraduate degree in population sciences here. And you've just shown us why anyone studying today actually has to be excited about studying statistics and how important they are. And I just want to congratulate you and your colleagues at ONS for really getting the COVID survey up and running in such a timely fashion. That was absolutely brilliant. I remember you calling me back in March 2020, and I just thought this is going to be impossible, and you've actually delivered the information that we needed. So we've got lots of questions coming in from our audience, and I remind the audience you can add them to Slido, and please do vote up the ones that you think are the most important. One's coming in from Judith Brody, says, how can a National Statistics Institute and all of us tackle the infodemic, not the pandemic, but the infodemic, and make sure people know and understand which statistics they can rely on?
Well, it's great to hear from Judith, who was, of course, a great student on the MSc in social statistics. And can I just also say, you know, that I mean, the reason we're all here is because of a guy called Tim Holt, who really did lead us initially. And I think Judith hit the nail on the head, because it is so easy to get masses and masses and masses of data. And what we need to do, I think, is to have those organizations that we really trust. So we are not at the ONS going to continue to put out masses and masses and masses of random data. You know, I am not going to say to you, I'll tell you something interesting about the labour force. What I'm going to do is say, what is the question that we need to answer, and how do we answer that in the most concise and straightforward way? And I think that that's a really important point, because too often we could just end up with a data deluge, and that's not where we need to be. And I think we do have a real responsibility always to engage with the public, to engage with people about the questions they want to answer, and then to answer questions in a concise and clear way.
So kind of sticking with that theme then, Ian, Matthew Keating has said, do you think public engagement with statistics is going to remain high post-pandemic? We've probably never seen so many statistics on the news.
Yeah, I think it will. I think it will. I think that people will continue to demand information, and I think that they are realizing that information can be provided in an accessible way. Too often people say, oh my God, it's a number, can't do that. Whereas now I think we are in a position where people are expecting to see the numbers, and they expect to see them in a timely way. And so I think we are going to see a continued engagement with statistics over time, but we have a real responsibility to maintain, as Judith said earlier, real insight, and a real responsibility to make sure that our numbers are accessible to people and interesting to people. So if you are from a particular group, what are our numbers saying about your population? When we built the census response, we worked with groups and said, look here, if you give us your data, we will be back, and we're planning that now, to tell you what your data say about your community. And I think, you know, in the kind of multi-community world in which we are now, that's incredibly important.
Thanks, Ian. This won't surprise you, but we've got a question here from Steve Smallwood, who says, has the need for accurate population denominators for the vaccine rollout shown that there's a justification for an almost real-time population register? Is it time for us to have one now?
Yeah, 100%. For colleagues who don't know, Steve, a population register is something that the Scandinavian countries have, which, if you like, has almost an ongoing census. And I think that's what we are trying to do using administrative data from a number of sources. So we will still be making estimates, not, if you like, having the final number, but we believe we can make estimates which will be much more accurate than anything we've been able to do in the past. And that will, I think, mean that we will have population denominators at low levels and at age-specific levels, which are much better and much more accurate than we've had in the past. And that will be of use to local authorities hugely over time.
Great, thanks. Ian, a lot of the data you showed us, well, all of the data you showed us tonight actually was for the UK. And Chris Shaw has asked, are you doing any work on international comparisons of COVID mortality?
Really interesting question from Chris. And yes, we have done some work on Europe where we look at regions. Different regions across Europe. And then what we do is, because not every country, it's very difficult making international comparisons because not every country defines a COVID death in exactly the same way. So what we use are excess deaths over the 5-year average, the graph I showed you in the talk, and we compare that between regions, and that has been quite instructive and shows the extent to which the UK epidemic, for example, the first wave, was a national epidemic in the way that certain other parts of Europe did not have that. We also, I'd have to say, have worked closely with 4 African countries that we have strong partnerships with to work to build relationships and share data, and that's with Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, and Ethiopia. And I think that too is really important.
Thanks, Ian. Gosh, the good and the great are online tonight. We've now got a question from Judith Phillips, who's Vice Principal at Stirling. And she says, this is an excellent example of the importance of social scientists. Ian, how do we promote the need for a chief social scientist?
I have to say, really interesting question from Judith. And entirely serendipitously, this afternoon, a number of social scientists from different academic institutions, including from Southampton, met with Sir Patrick Vallance and 1 or 2 of the chief scientific advisors to talk about how we might increase the role that social science can play in the National Risk Register. And I think that's really, really super important, because issues of community, issues of welfare, issues of demography, issues of local leadership are ever more important. And will we get to a chief social scientist? I don't know about that. But what I do think is worth saying is that under Sir Patrick Vallance's leadership, we have a much greater acceptance and understanding of the role that social science can play alongside the natural sciences in informing government of its research base. And I think it also is a need for researchers to be prepared to address and to think about these really important areas.
Thanks, Ian. And Dame Judith McGregor, who's one of our members of council here, and of course is also well known to you, Ian, has said, has levelling up become more difficult to achieve after the pandemic? Have the North and South grown further apart in terms of economic and social equalities?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not so sure that any further would be true. I would say, though, that if you look at some of the local areas that have experienced, particularly in the second wave of the pandemic, and indeed the third wave of the pandemic, experienced the highest levels, and you compared a map of them with a map of, shall we say, infant mortality in the 19th century, it would look pretty similar. So I do think my answer to Judith would be, I don't think things have got any worse, but I do think that there remain important inequalities across our country. And one of the things that I'm really, really keen on is the whole point I made about sub-local data, because you can take, I mean, for example, we helped Chris Whitty put out a piece on coastal towns recently. And coastal towns are really, really super challenging, because you've got abject poverty alongside quite wealthy places. And so actually understanding and being able to impact on that subnational basis is, I think, incredibly important. I do think we are likely to see more work with local areas. We are talking with Tees Valley, for example, about how to impact on that local area. And the Economic and Social Research Council, as you will know, Jane, have a real belief that providing local data to enable local areas to be able to inform policy is going to be incredibly important. So I think levelling up is really exciting. I think there is a lot that can be done, but it does require timely, accurate and informative data. And that's what I hope we will be able to work with our colleagues at the Department of Levelling Up, Communities and Housing to deliver.
Thanks, Ian. A question in from Professor Phil Rees. So welcome, Phil, from Leeds. What plans does ONS have for improving ethnic population and components data?
Really, really good point, and I would have expected nothing less from Phil Rees, and lovely to hear from you, Phil. Our plans are very much those of using linked data to be able, and based on the 21 census, to be able to continue to improve our local population estimates by ethnicity. And I think this pandemic has really shown the need to do that. And to understand the different advantages and disadvantages and conditions of living that different groups have in order to be able to impact on policy. But I do think it is important that we really do use the 21 census, which has some unbelievable data as the basis for really ensuring that we have accurate estimates at local areas by ethnicity.
Okay, we could go on all night, Ian. I'm just going to give you a final question before I hand that back over to the Vice-Chancellor, which is actually from Madeline Ryan. And she says, how would you recommend or teach young viewers of statistics on the media to understand what's presented? So what top tips have you got for getting these complicated statistics over to teenagers and school children?
I think the first thing to do is always, I tend to ask questions. So let's ask questions. Let's get ourselves into a position where everybody's asking questions and where the data are answering those questions. I've got about 6 or 7 rules for drawing a graph, and I think if you stick to those, you're in pretty good shape. And I think you just have to give people confidence. Too often people don't have confidence in numbers, and my view is that everybody can do numbers. It was an enormous privilege, Jane, at Southampton to teach an intro course on statistics, and we had so much fun. And actually, statistics is unbelievably good fun. And I think if you can convey that enthusiasm alongside answering real questions in a way that is engaging, then people will understand. And indeed, we had an engagement last week with a blogger and social influencer called Jack Monroe, and she very kindly put out a tweet afterwards saying after this conversation she wished she'd done more mathematics at age 16, and I thought that was really, really nice, and it just showed the absolute energy and enthusiasm that my colleagues Mike Hardy and Mike Keegan enthused her with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. I'm going to hand back now to the Vice-Chancellor.
So thanks, Jane, for that. And of course, mainly thanks to Ian. I knew what we were in store for tonight, but every time you get a presentation from Ian, it's always very uplifting. The pure enthusiasm came through, and it's great to have someone with such energy and vision leading our National Statistics Service. I don't know whether I'd go quite so far as to say they're fantastic fun, but they sound a lot of fun, basically, which I certainly agree with. And I think some of that wide range, that tour de force, as Jane said, that you gave us was really, really inspiring. And effectively, as a UK citizen, knowing that our statistics service gets that endorsement internationally, I think shows how lucky we are. And sometimes the things you have in your backyard you take for granted, and we should never take any of this for granted. So thank you very much for that, Ian. Can I also say thank you to the colleagues behind the scenes who put all of the organisation in to making tonight happen. I have the easy job of turning up and saying thank you at the start and the end, but it's an incredible lot of hard work that goes into making events like this happen. So thank you to them, and then thank you to our audience, because an event like this is something that is put on for you, our stakeholders from a range of backgrounds. And I think one of the things we've learned from COVID is how you can make much greater reach through a virtual meeting. There's great advantages to meeting in person, but also, as you heard from the range of places people were dropping in from tonight, I don't think you'd have come here from Stirling, even to hear Ian Diamond tonight. So, but I think that the ability to join tonight, I think, is a great plus of technology. Just two other things before we go. In a moment, you're going to see a short poll, which I'd kindly asked you to complete, so that we get our statistics about how you found this meeting. So please spend a couple of minutes doing that, and we will in a few days' time be sharing a record of today's meeting. So look out for your inboxes and make sure it doesn't go into the trash, because obviously you'll be able to look back at this and ponder some of those many numbers that Ian gave us. So thank you again, Ian. It's great to catch up with you, even if it's virtually. And of course, thank you, our audience, for coming tonight. And I hope you felt it. I'm sure you did feel it was well spent. Thank you for your interest in the University of Southampton, and look forward to seeing you at future events. Good evening.
Thank you.